For the efforts of the state of Palestine to mobilize international support.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to a special episode of the Pakistan Pivot. If you're wondering who I am and where your usual host is, so आज हमारे साथ as a guest मौजूद हैं Maryam Kiyani, who is a research journalist and also the usual host of this podcast. Maryam, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine. In the context of the 48th OIC conference that happened in Islamabad yesterday and the day before, Maryam and her team were there to attend the conference, and she's here today to tell us about how her experience was and what happened in the conference in general. अच्छा मरियम, तो एक आम इंसान की नज़र से, एक मेरे जैसा इंसान जिसको कुछ ख़ास पता नहीं है, आप पहले में बता सकती हैं कि OIC है क्या? मतलब इसका पर्पज़ क्या है, इसकी बुनियाद किसने रखी और करता क्या है?
Of course. तो OIC, which is the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, एक group है जो 1969 में बना था, and it is a group of 57 member states and a few observer states, which include Russia and Thailand, for example. जो Muslim majority मुल्क इसमें 49 हैं, बाकी are also Muslim minority countries, but essentially जो group है, the bloc, it consists of countries from Middle East, from Africa, from Near East, and from Asia. और ये दुनिया ये मिला के 2 बिलियन लोगों का ग्रुप है, एंड इट्स 23% ऑफ द वर्ल्ड्स पॉपुलेशन, एंड आई थिंक ग्रोइंगली इट्स बिकमिंग मोर एंड मोर इम्पॉर्टेंट, क्योंकि 60% ऑफ द वर्ल्ड्स कॉन्फ्लिक्ट दैट वी आर सीइंग टुडे मुस्लिम दुनिया में हो रही है. एंड सो फॉर दिस ग्रुप टू बी अ यूनाइटेड फ्रंट अगेंस्ट दीज अट्रॉसिटीज़ विद इन द मुस्लिम वर्ल्ड एंड देन टारगेटेड टू द मुस्लिम वर्ल्ड आउटसाइड ऑफ द मुस्लिम वर्ल्ड की वजह से इट्स बिकमिंग मोर एंड मोर इम्पॉर्टेंट. एंड इन लाइट of course a lot of that, the annual session took place, which I and my team attended. Yep.
I'll just ask you again to put this in more layman terms कि यूनाइटेड फ्रंट का क्या मतलब है, किस तरह से ऑपरेट करती है, क्या सिस्टम क्या है, एक कमरे में बंद होते हैं, उसके बाद किस तरह से प्लेनरी आगे चलती है? If you can just explain that a bit.
ठीक है, स्ट्रक्चर वाइज आई थिंक इट वुड बी हेल्पफुल कि अगर हम देखें कि OIC चार्टर क्या है, तो एसेंशली जो बुनियाद है वो है टू सेफगार्ड मुस्लिम वैल्यूज़ एंड टू क्रिएट international peace and harmony of the Muslim world together with the international world, and उसमें मुस्लिम दुनिया की protection, sovereignty against atrocities towards Muslim community, या तो फिर conflicts within the Muslim world. So the concept of ummat basically is what I mean when I say the United Front, and that's what all these countries mean when they come together to sit. अब होता क्या है is essentially, जिस तरह for example this session जो इस्लामाबाद में होस्ट हुआ, पाकिस्तान ने होस्ट किया at the parliament, there were 47 ministerial members, which means कि foreign ministers आए हुए थे और बाकी were representatives, but they all 57 member states had their presence at the event. And so what you do is आपकी inaugural session होता है, उसमें you come in, you give speeches, you discuss the agendas, उसके बाद you have off media, of course, you have more discussions on the sidelines, and then the next day you had again more discussions that they came in at the parade as well. The 23rd March के साथ इस दफ़ा align हुआ, which was again more historic and symbolic for Pakistan because National Day के साथ आपकी ये summit आप host कर रहे थे, and then you had a conference, a media talk of sorts, जिसमें आपने basically अपनी resolutions बताएं. So 140 resolutions were passed in that, and a declaration, an Islamabad declaration it's called, it's a really long one, you can look it up as well. वो फिर उसमें उसकी briefing दी गई. So that is the structure, जिस तरह it works. इस साल इस context में हुआ. We can of course go on in detail to talk about the contents of it. Yeah.
So before we go on and delve into that detail, I'm just going to ask you this, with as someone of your age, how did you feel like going to the conference? Like, for a lack of a better word, what was the vibe like at the Parliament House yesterday?
Yeah. So it was very nice, of course. It's because the OIC is the second largest organization, international intergovernmental organization after the UN. And it is a big organization in terms of the people it hosts, the countries it has, the topics that are on its agenda. And again, because of the time and the political context, it was all the more important. So us context mein, of course, it was, and तो वो तो था the factor, right? But the added with that was, of course, that Pakistan is hosting it, and that is a really nice feeling because if at the conference there was a great acknowledgement and appreciation of the fact that Pakistan is a key player in the OIC and in terms of the agendas of the OIC, and of course hosting on its own, hosting successfully with good experiences given to the member states that were there is an added plus. So being there, being able to speak to delegations, I spoke to delegates from different worlds. You had the Taliban ke aaye the, you had people from Sudan, from Somalia, you had Iraq representatives, you had foreign ministers, Turkey ke. So to be able to speak to all of them, to be able to speak to groups of the Arab League or the culture centers of the OIC or their delegates at the UN or EU, of course there was a lot of understanding by all of them of ke Pakistan has done a great job in terms of hosting this, and of course us pe jo agendas mein bhi topics hain in terms of being able to take stance on each of them. And so together I think with all of this, my own experience coupled with acknowledgement given in the speeches and also in jo many personally conversations came with the delegates was a really, really nice experience and a lot of learning as well about the OIC, about the conference, and about just understanding the Muslim world and its situations right now better. Yep.
So that sounds like a lot of fun that you had. Now going into the conference and its agendas, can you tell us about what the agenda of the conference was this time around?
Of course. The agenda was partnering for unity, peace and development. And उसमें हमने देखा कि on the forefront, before even the conference began, बात हो रही थी कि कश्मीर पे बहुत ज़्यादा बात होगी, पैलेस्टाइन पे बहुत ज़्यादा बात होगी, and अफ़गानिस्तान पे रिव्यू में बात होगी, अभी करंट सिचुएशन के हवाले से बात होगी. And of course it happened 22-23 मार्च को कॉन्फ्रेंस हुई, which is 7 days after the 15th March, which was recognized as the International Day to Combat Islamophobia. तो वो एक context भी था which was again celebrated across the Muslim world, and because Pakistan spearheaded that, तो वो एक context था कि पता था कि इस बारे में भी agenda में बात होगी. तो essentially ये major areas of discussion थे जिसमें these were discussed in light of economy, in light of war, in light of humanitarian crisis. Russia Ukraine पे भी briefly बात हुई, which is that of course it was talked about कि उस पे क्या स्टांस है, और कोविड-19 पे बात हुई, वैक्सीन्स वगैरह पे बात हुई. एंड सो द एजेंडा ऑफ द डिस्कशन विच इज़ टू से कि स्पीचेस में क्या बात हुई, एंड देन लेटर द नेक्स्ट डे जो डेक्लरेशंस पास हुई उनमें जो बात हुई was majorly around these, of course with a lot of minor points about other conflicts like smaller countries such as say Azerbaijan, Armenia, such as Bosnia ka jo conflict hai, Yemen, Syria, and just generally a lot about different groups like the Islamic Development Bank वगैरह उस तरह. So overall, if this is the sort of framework जिसके under ये 48 CFM हुआ है.
So you mentioned about the speeches that happened at the OIC. Can you just quickly tell us about who all spoke at the conference?
Yeah, I can. About the speeches, it started with Niger. Uske baad Shah Mahmood Qureshi, the foreign minister of Pakistan, he gave a speech. Then you had Saudi Arab's Prince Faisal bin Farhan. He spoke for a bit. And then you had the OIC General Secretary, Haseen Brahim Taha, who spoke for a longer duration, जिसमें उन्होंने apart from these agendas भी उन्होंने काफ़ी ज़्यादा areas discuss किए about the Muslim world and the problems that the Muslim world is faced with. So that was a relatively longer speech. Uske baad you had groups represented by different countries. So for example, Kazakhstan ke foreign minister spoke on behalf of the Asia group. Then you had Tunisia ke representative there of the foreign minister again, who spoke on behalf of the Arab group. Then you also had the UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres, जिन्होंने आके speech की. उन्होंने उसमें रशिया यूक्रेन की बात की, कश्मीर पैलेस्टाइन का उन्होंने कहा we support the cause that the Muslim world is putting forward, etc. And then you had this time around you also had the China's foreign minister, which is the first time China was at the OIC, and he was invited as a special guest. So you saw OIC और China की उसमें उन्होंने बात की speech में. And then if I'm not missing anybody, फिर we had the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, give his speech at the end. So this was the inaugural session for the first day. So 22nd March को ये आपका format था. And then the next day, which is the media takeout, जिसमें declarations वगैरह पास हुई, उसमें again पाकिस्तान के foreign minister and prime minister kind of with the general secretary, and after all these meetings जो sidelines पे हुई थी, the declarations and the 140 resolutions were kind of shared in brief with the media.
Okay, so now we're going to go discuss the topics one by one that were talked about in the OIC. You mentioned Afghanistan earlier. I was talked about. We have seen Afghanistan situation develop over the last year. What did you see was the united opinion of the OIC about Afghanistan, right, and how did Afghanistan feel about it?
हाँ ठीक है. So about Afghanistan, it was, the context was such कि पिछले December 2021 में पाकिस्तान ने, if you remember, host किया था extraordinary session of the OIC,
yes,
which was on Afghanistan, and उसमें भी you had a lot of these OIC member states, but you also had envoys from the P5, you had UN, you had EU, so there was a lot of international delegates also present outside of the OIC, but permanent delegates जिस तरह होते हैं to UN, EU वगैरह. And उसमें you saw that there was talk done about the political situation, about the government, about the humanitarian crisis, the funds, the assets जो freeze हुए हुए थे, this and that. And so there was a big question जब ये OIC even शुरू भी हो रही थी कि what was the result of that, and now you have Afghanistan again on the agenda, so how will that look like? So on that front, what was done was that there was a review given on what the last extraordinary session did, and उसमें, for example, a humanitarian trust fund was inaugurated, जो अफगानिस्तान के लिए एक trust fund bana hai with the Islamic Development Bank and the entire OIC. So that was inaugurated. A special envoy to Afghanistan of the OIC was decided. There was greater emphasis. Another thing that happened was that the last time, this is very interesting, last time the foreign minister of the Taliban government came to Islamabad for the extraordinary session, and if you remember the photo op mein, he wasn't a part of the picture. There was the Afghanistan seat, but he wasn't there, and us waqt obviously the government was not recognized, still is not, it's still in political limbo. But is dafa humne dekha ki the foreign minister didn't come in, but his special representative of foreign affairs was there along with another representative. So they were there, and Afghanistan pe wahi baat hui which has been happening since the Taliban takeover essentially. Okay, the humanitarian crisis is great, and so there needs to be help given by the Muslim world, but in the entire world, about the humanitarian crisis in terms of food, assistance, security. So that was talked about. It was कि political settlement is the solution, and we need to sit together, we need to reach that political settlement. And then there was also talk about terrorism, which is कि Shah Mahmood Qureshi ने अपनी speech में, for example, कहा कि पाकिस्तान के लिए Pakistan has always emphasized that a stable and peaceful Afghanistan is in Pakistan's benefit, and so Pakistan wants to work with Afghanistan and the OIC and the international world to create, to combat terrorism and to eliminate Daesh and Al-Qaeda, and to fight TTP, ETIM और इस तरह के जो terrorist groups हैं, and to not let the Afghan soil be used for terrorist activities in Pakistan or in any of the neighboring countries or elsewhere in the world as well. So I think Afghanistan पे ये बात हुई थी, and in Prime Minister Imran Khan's speech, what he talked about Afghanistan was a thing that he does talk about a lot, which is the Pashtun character. And this time around also he talked about how the Pashtun character does not allow कि उनके ऊपर कोई rule करे, and तो आप उनको sovereignty दें और आप उनको right to self rule दें, and आप you work with them together to kind of create a peaceful and prosperous Afghanistan that is beneficial for the people, but also for the neighboring countries in the entire world. So Afghanistan pe, apart from the update from the review in terms of the fund and gave out the developments thing, again there was emphasis on reaching a political settlement and reaching a peaceful, stable Afghanistan together, and not isolating Afghanistan as of now. Yep.
So then let's all be hopeful for what happens in Afghanistan next. Now we're going to go towards Kashmir. And with Kashmir, we've seen that over the years, it's become a staple grievance of Pakistan. And wherever there's Pakistan in a political forum globally, it's expected of Pakistan to speak of Kashmir, right? What I want to ask off of you is, what is the stance of the global, at least the Muslim global community on Kashmir right now? And what was the agenda about Kashmir that was discussed in the OIC?
The stance was unanimous on Kashmir, which was Kashmiri people's right to self-determination and condemning Indian illegal occupation of Kashmir. So from the speeches that were given, and then even later in jo sidelines pe meetings hui, and then baad mein jo resolutions pass hui on Kashmir, all of them unanimously agreed against illegal occupation of Kashmir. In that, if I can go on in detail to talk about it, Pakistan had invited all-party Hurriyat conference ke leader, chairman to the OIC, but he's in under house arrest, I believe, in Kashmir. And so we had another representative from the Hurriyat conference come in. The play card said a true representative of the Kashmiri people, and he was there. And the jo resolutions thi ya jo stance tha on Kashmir, like I said, was about for its self-rule. But then later I was reading up about how while this was happening, simultaneously around the same days, एक Gulf summit हो रही है in Kashmir, which is that UAE के बहुत ज़्यादा delegates गए हैं with a lot of economic opportunities with the Indian government, जिसमें कश्मीर भी शामिल है, जिसमें Indian occupied Kashmir शामिल है. And so, that is also happening. And then this is happening, which is, part of kis tarah conference se bahir also, certain actions are happening. But then within the conference, of course, you do see that there was condemnation of the occupation. And in the declaration jo final day pe hui thi, usme there was emphasis on कि अभी तक ये conferences होती हैं, resolutions pass होती हैं, but this time there will be actionable items on them. And उसमें what we saw was that it was decided in the declaration, it was said कि regular meetings होंगी of these groups about Kashmir, and they will also work with international headquarters of the UN in Geneva या in Jeddah, जिसमें discuss होंगी the atrocities happening, and there will be a review done of sorts. तो एक monitoring के लिहाज से बात हुई कि किस तरह monitor करेगी OIC, the Muslim world, of what is happening in Kashmir together, rather than कि वो एक पाकिस्तान इंडिया की वो एक चीज़ बनी रहे जिसमें पाकिस्तान कहता रहे कि मतलब India is doing this, India is also doing this with its own Muslim community, Muslim population in India itself, and Kashmir में ये हो रहा है and ये वो, and वो it keeps on going that way only. जिस तरह हुआ भी जब पाकिस्तान ने invite किया हुर्रियत leaders को, तो India took a lot of issue with that, and they said कि this is violation of our territorial integrity. So what the OIC did in terms of Kashmir was to kind of expand that and take it on a larger Muslim world के उस पे, and to give a united and to also kind of say कि post-conference किस तरह the Muslim community will work together to continue to review and monitor through regular meetings, through more regular checks and of sorts. So essentially Kashmir पे ये stance था.
So I think that's great to hear, because I think what that would do is that would bring Kashmir issue into the global political framework in a way that it's not just a Pakistan-India conflict, and it would be addressed as a human rights issue, which it actually is.
Yes.
Moving on from that, आजकल हम एक देख रहे हैं कि बहुत मेन जो दुनिया का मसला चल रहा है वो एक रशिया यूक्रेन वॉर का चल रहा है, और उससे ना सिर्फ ग्लोबल इकोनॉमीज इम्पैक्ट हुई हैं, उससे ऑफ कोर्स बहुत ज़्यादा फॉरेन रिलेशंस भी इम्पैक्ट होते हैं बहुत से कंट्रीज़ के, एंड दैट इंक्लूड्स मुस्लिम कंट्रीज एज वेल. सो इन लाइट ऑफ दैट वॉर दैट्स गोइंग ऑन राइट नाउ, व्हाट डू यू सी इज द स्टैंस ऑफ OIC on this particular war?
I think Russia-Ukraine पे, if I am remembering correctly, इतनी detailed में discussion नहीं हुई, because it wasn't the top agenda priority. Of course, it was something जो हो रहा था, तो all countries did give their stance, and the stance was एक ही कि we are against war, और war का humanitarian impact होता है, ripple effect होता है, and so political negotiations के through the problem should be addressed, and जो attacks हो रहे हैं, जो bombardments हो रही हैं, they should be put to an end, जो Ukrainian लोगों का impact हो रहा है, and that war is not the solution. तो उस पे I think everybody did address it. ऐसा नहीं था कि address नहीं हुआ, but it wasn't talked about in a lot of greater detail as other topics were perhaps, but the stance was united.
Okay, perfect. Another major problem that we see in the today's Muslim world essentially is of Israel and Palestine. And to think that this is the 48th Council of Foreign Ministers of Islamic countries, and there is no formidable solution that we have seen about Palestine over the years. Where did OIC this year stand on the Palestine issue? Of course, it is a human rights violation that's happening blatantly in Palestine. But then we see members of the same council, same cooperation, working with Israel, probably being involved in arms deals with Israel as well. So how do you feel that it was addressed in this particular conference?
That's a very good question. I think Palestine, of course, was a major agenda topic, priority topic of the conference. And what we saw was essentially that there was recognition by the OIC that it has not done enough on Palestine. So to start off, मतलब ये तो एक understanding थी कि to let के ये इतनी बड़ी grave conflict of humanitarian violations of international humanitarian law is happening since years is a failure of the OIC to begin with. The Prime Minister, talked that Palestine is our failure. Like the OIC has failed Palestinian people. He said that about Kashmir as well. He said that the OIC has failed the Kashmiri people. So wo thi understanding, and usme of course a part of it has to do with the fact that not all countries want to take a stance against Israel with the same intensity. आप condemn, कुछ लोग सिर्फ statement, कुछ countries सिर्फ statement तक हैं, कुछ countries, just for example, Pakistan does not recognize Israel at all. And then, certain, like you said, are also involved in deals, involved in their economy strengthening, involved in trade ties, politically, otherwise, recognition है ये. So this, I think, goes beyond the conference कि आपकी foreign policy किस तरह इसको देखती है. But about the conference, if that's what I can talk about, since I'm not an expert on the other thing, which is the foreign policy of countries towards Israel. But I think conference may, again, it was agreed by all countries that it is a problem that needs a solution and that a just resolution needs to be passed about Palestine. I think perhaps जो मैं स्पीचेस सुन रही थी उसमें जो जनरल सेक्रेटरी थे OIC के हसीन इब्राहिम ताहा, उनकी स्पीच was I think the most clear in terms of condemning जो हो रहा है and calling it what it is. तो उन्होंने कहा कि ये apartheid है, ethnic cleansing है, human right violations हैं, and that this is something that the OIC condemns and it needs to put an end on. But there was, and then even the जो सऊदी प्रिंस की स्पीच थी, जो UN सेक्रेटरी जनरल की स्पीच थी, अरब ग्रुप की, सब ने यूनानिमसली, चाइना के जो फॉरेन मिनिस्टर थे उन्होंने भी कंडेम किया और उन्होंने कहा, चाइना in fact said that we share the same sentiment as the group. So वो था, and then I think there was the recognition of the failure, and उसमें I think the Prime Minister Imran Khan, what he said was कि the OIC couldn't do what social media has done now. So there was this understanding कि perhaps अब जो Palestinian conflict जो है of demolitions, of evacuations, of resettlements, of kicking these people out, and of settler colonies जो यहाँ पे बन रही हैं, जो इजरायली लोग कब्जा कर रहे हैं घरों पे Palestinians के, ये वो उसके ये जो सारी चीज़ है which is the part of जो problem है by the Israeli state level पे जो हो रहा है, ये document हुई है because of social media. And so there was this understanding कि ये OIC should have done this. 1969 से अगर ये ग्रुप बना हुआ है तो एक इतनी बड़ी मुस्लिम कम्युनिटी की, एक मुल्क की के साथ इतनी ज़्यादती हो रही है और वो नहीं एड्रेस हुई, उस पर कुछ भी नहीं हो सका टैंजिबल. एंड परहैप्स अब जो अगर आवाज़ भी उठना शुरू हुई है वो सोशल मीडिया की वजह से हुई है. Which we saw, if you remember, during last year, there was a lot of young activists from Palestine who took to social media and who voiced कि क्या हो रहा है, who documented, और वो फिर जो narrative था of the Palestinian people, perhaps for the first time in their history, वो निकला from Palestine and it came to the west and to Asia and to east and to other areas, and एक बात होना शुरू हुई because now it is on the internet and it's in the footage form. So उस पे then बात हुई कि using social media, using diplomatic tools and using forums like the OIC to continuously keep on condemning there needs to be a solution to the conflict. And of course I believe उसमें there was this understanding कि foreign policy फिर भी हर country की होगी, but that this is a problem, and उस पे भी that is the sort of stance that was provided by the OIC at the session.
So you talked about China. I'm really interested to find out how China ended up being there. And what was China's motive तो मैं नहीं कहूँगा, लेकिन चाइना का पूरी कॉन्फ्रेंस के दरमियान क्या रोल रहा. और also एक और question which I think you should address with this question, were the Uyghur Muslims talked about in the conference? Because China being an oppressor in its capacity in that particular issue, and being a special guest in the conference, how do you see that tying in, and what was China's role in general?
Right. Okay, so China was for the first time a part of the OIC because China is not an observer state, China is not a member state. This time China was invited, the foreign minister was here at the conference as a special guest. And I can tell you a bit about the speech, what he gave. तो speech में उन्होंने ये बात की, he talked about कि there is a fight against a certain civilization by another civilization. So what he was saying was कि West किस तरह East को certain तरीके से portray करता है. And of course he was talking about this in the context of Islamophobia. So because there was a lot of talk happening about Islamophobia and this united hatred against the Muslim communities and prejudices and this and that, उसी में then the foreign minister talked about how certain civilizations are seen as terrorists or are seen as oppressors or aggressors, and there's a lot of hypocrisy in that. तो उन्होंने generally ये बात की about where China kind of comes into that, and he saw China being a victim, you can say, of this sort of thinking as well. तो एक तो ये stance था. उसके अलावा about the agenda topics में जो थे, तो उसमें he said कि we share the same hope about Kashmir as the rest of the bloc, and that actually did take a lot of became very controversial, because if you read up now in the papers, India ने उस पे issue लिया है, and they've said कि China does not have any locus standi, like a standing point to kind of to talk about Kashmir. Kashmir is an internal matter, and China is nobody to kind of comment on that or to say that it shares the same hope as the rest of the OIC. So this was something जो Chinese foreign minister ने बात की. He also talked about other Afghanistan पे भी बात हुई, Palestine पे भी बात हुई, briefly of course, but that is the kind of the stance. About the Uyghur community, I don't recall that it was mentioned specifically in terms of जिस तरह म्यांमार community की बात, रोहिंग्या Muslims की बात हुई in Myanmar, और जिस तरह औरों की बात हुई, I don't recall कि Uyghur community की उस तरह बात हुई है. But the Chinese and the Chinese foreign minister will of course disagree with you, जो आपने उनको oppressor कहा है. So in that they said कि we are combating terrorism within our own country and through the help of the OIC, and that together it's a clash of civilizations, and we have to kind of grow out of it together as a bloc. So that's the kind of entry point, you can say, of China with the OIC. I think perhaps एक थोड़ा सा civilization lens से it was understood, and the speech was given. And in fact sideline पे बहुत ज़्यादा meeting हुई हैं of the foreign minister. So apart from the speech, he met with the foreign minister of Pakistan, the prime minister of Pakistan, and then also with other groups and delegations together to kind of so he was a really active part of the conference this time around, and for the first time this happened. I think also in light of the CPEC and Pakistan-China dosti, there was also about China's support in economy-wise for the Muslim world. So in terms of vaccines, or in terms of just generally BRI का अब किस तरह Muslim world के साथ अगर वो link बनता है, CPEC अगर अफगानिस्तान enter होता है, तो ये सारा context sidelines पे भी इन पे बात हुई है, and even in the speech and generally. So that's also another, of course, thing where China, from an economic point of view and a development point of view, and development was a part of the agenda. So वो also kind of, I think, came together with Pakistan kind of having China as the special guest for the session.
Sahi. Also, I also find that funny that India takes offense in China commenting about Kashmir, where China is actually a party to the Ladakh-Kashmir agreement in the first place. But that's how politics works. Another thing that you mentioned earlier was about Islamophobia and how it was also part of the agenda. And I think we've covered the theme in general. But क्या इस्लामोफोबिया के ऊपर क्या इस वक्त स्टांस है ग्लोबली? हमें पता है कि 15 मार्च डिक्लेयर कर दिया गया है एक इस्लामोफोबिया के ख़िलाफ़ दिन, लेकिन क्या सेंटिमेंट क्या है इस वक्त, स्पेशली ऑफ द मुस्लिम कंट्रीज़ एंड ऑफ कोर्स कंट्रीज़ लाइक चाइना एंड अदर ऑब्जर्वर स्टेट्स?
सो ऑफ कोर्स कॉन्टेक्स्ट वही है जो आपने बताया 15 मार्च का, which is now recognized as the International Day to Combat Islamophobia. I think in terms of sentiment or in terms of understanding the issue, I thought that the understanding was good. It didn't seem as, जिस तरह generally पाकिस्तान में अगर बात होती है about Islamophobia across the world or in the region, perhaps बहुत ज़्यादा बात होती है about what's happening in the neighbor. तो इंडिया क्या कर रहा है with its हिंदुत्व ideology. मुस्कान बीबी वाली for example जो एक incident हुआ where the goons were kind of coming at her with like stakes and shouting at her, and then तो पाकिस्तान में बहुत ज़्यादा बात होती है in terms of India's persecution of its Muslim population in India. तो that is of course a part of the conversation about Islamophobia, but at the OIC I thought कि वो बहुत globally understand हो रही थी, and it was understood in a nuanced way, if I can say, which meant कि आप उसमें समझ रहे थे कि ये इसके एक तो इसके रूट्स क्या हैं, ये कब से आया है, इसकी क्या फॉर्म्स इसने ली हैं. एंड ऑफ कोर्स वी हैव सीन दिस गवर्नमेंट बी वेरी एक्टिव अबाउट कंडेमिंग और टेकिंग issue with Islamophobic acts around the world, to which if we saw the cartoons of the Prophet being made, or if we saw France के खिलाफ जो bans लगना शुरू हुए थे, and then there were incidents like New Zealand में जो एक mass shooting हुई थी in a mosque, all of these are Islamophobic acts. इसके अलावा banning of hijab in certain communities like France, in certain countries like France. तो at this I think इमरान खान की speech की अगर मैं बात करूँ, so he talked in detail about Islamophobia, और उसमें उन्होंने यही बात की, the understanding was that it's something which has increased or rather developed as a result of war on terror 9/11 के बाद. post 9/11 जो एक दुनिया बनी वो एक मुसलमान इंसान के लिए कैसी थी is essentially it was not a good life, it was not a good from the international community. बहुत ज़्यादा तरीक़ों से बहुत ज़्यादा prejudices थे, stereotypes थे जो state level पे globally institutionalize हो गए कि वो बहुत ज़्यादा चीज़ें होती रहीं, and the OIC did not do enough, and so there was understanding that the OIC needs to do more. The OIC has passed this resolution and वो UNGA से approve हो गई है, which is very historic, and so I think it was a rather celebratory context जिसमें एक थी understanding कि एक milestone achieve हो गया है about Islamophobia, और उसकी understanding यही थी कि this is targeted towards a certain community and it is something which needs to be addressed as it is, which is कि it's hatred towards a certain religion and towards a certain belief system, rather than कि बस एक mass shooting हो गई because the man was not mentally well, for example, or that. So rather कि आप इनको as standalone incidents देखें, आप इसको address करें as a problem around the world, not just in India or not just in the neighbor, but across the world, the Europe being a big part of it, as Islamophobia essentially. And उसमें about how the OIC has this observatory of the Islamophobia report, जिसमें वो like recognize करते हैं, वो monitor करते हैं of incidents of Islamophobia happening around the world, and that it will work with organizations like the UN or like human rights and the European Union etc. to kind of make sure कि ये curb होते रहें, so that they are decreased and eliminated after all.
Okay, so Maryam, up until now हमने बात की है about the grievances of the Muslim community and the problems that they face. I'm going to take a more pragmatic turn in this conversation now, and we see that most of the Muslim countries that are part of this coalition or cooperation are war-torn. Countries like Iraq, Syria, Yemen, even Pakistan for that matter, which is not in the best economic conditions as of now. Where do you see the efforts of OIC, and how were they addressed in this particular conference in resolving the economic problems? Because at the end of the day, it's a world where money is the supreme, money is of supreme importance.
That's a good question, because economy ki, of course the discussion has become the most important in a lot of different forums like these जो आप देखते हैं. SCO हुआ पहले, उसमें again economy, development, regional connectivity was at the forefront. Even if you see outside of this region, there's greatest understanding of कि economy is at the forefront of basically superiority or warfare or ये. So and there is understanding of that. Unfortunately अगर आप देखें तो जो OIC के member states हैं, जो मुल्क हैं, जो मुस्लिम दुनिया है इस वक्त, because of war, because of sanctions, because of invasions of the West on certain Muslim countries, and because of even internal matters like corruption, for example. Somalia को अगर आप देखें, अगर आप South Sudan को देखें, Libya, Yemen, Syria that you mentioned are all countries that have depressing economies. मतलब बुरे हालात हैं in terms of people's access to basic human rights because of poverty, because of access to these access to these water, education, things like these. And so ye sara context was there. You had Lebanon, for example, also another very suffering economy, and now even suffering more because of the war crisis is in Ukraine and Russia. Humne even because of the gas crisis that we saw globally this year, we saw these countries further suffer. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of money, development, and economy. And उसमें if I can briefly talk about के OIC किस तरह इसको समझ रहा है and what is it doing to address all of it. You had so there's this group, the Islamic Development Bank, which was there. The president was there and he spoke about what its role is, and it has a great role because अगर आपका Islamic Development Bank है, it's like how does it understand all of it. तो जिस तरह हमने अफगानिस्तान की बात समझी थी, which is that the Humanitarian Trust Fund with the Islamic Development Bank was formed. Similarly, there was talk that was done about the Islamic Development Bank's role in helping these economies, these war-torn economies. और उसमें with the speech that was given by the Secretary General, उसमें उन्होंने कहा कि in terms of health sector, education, poverty elimination, technology, tourism, in sab pe, together the Muslim world needs to work together to create groups and to create treaties and agreements जो इस तरह mutually beneficial हों. Economy की there was also at the declaration हमने देखा कि the OIC declared that it takes there was talk about anti-corruption वगैरह. तो जो UN report है, the fact-eye report, that was welcomed. There was talk about IMF के एक certain grants हैं which are called the SDRs. So how they should be, the unutilized grants from those should be given to the developing countries and the war-torn countries, which includes a lot of the Muslim world. तो उस पे बात हुई. And then another thing which was shared in the press takeout the last day was about these $180 million funds for hydropower projects in Pakistan, so which includes the Mohammed Dam, for example. So within Pakistan is pithi, and then economy was understood through digital economy, blue economy, technology, and there was talk about all of this. And I think this is one area jo with time we'll see ke, if funds are established or if mutual ties of trade etc are established, because Islamic Development Bank का हम काम देखते हैं in terms of infrastructure in say Egypt वगैरह, in Africa, in Gambia, in different. तो how we see this OIC की जो conversations हैं take into action. I think only time will tell how much of that is being able to help the countries and the war-torn people of these Muslim communities.
So then let's hope that these initiatives can also ignite responses from the more developed Muslim countries and more wealthier Muslim countries.
Like the Gulf countries, for example, unki councils and
into helping their Muslim brothers, as they say. I'm going to take a more analytical turn at this point because I feel like we have gone through what the conference was all about. Within the Muslim world, within the members of the OIC, we see a lot of conflict going on. There's the grander scheme of the Shia-Sunni conflict. There's also a big conflict, a cold conflict between Saudi Arab and Iran. And there's a bunch of proxy wars going on in different parts of Turkey and Yemen and Syria. How do you feel that manifests itself in matters of mutual interest within the conference, and how do you see that? How did you observe that in speeches that were given by, let's say, the delegates of these countries?
I think that's a good question. There's only so much I can say again because I'm not an expert, and I can kind of share कि क्या उस पे क्या understanding थी of all of it. Because of course ये जो सारी conflicts हैं जिसकी आपने बात की, these extend outside of the session itself. It's about foreign policy of these countries and internal matters of sorts. But this is very true that there are conflicts which are between Muslim countries. Just for example, if you see Saudi Arab and its conflict with Iran, तो Saudi Iran जो सारी conflict है, जो cold war of sorts है, उसमें of course Yemen and Syria are negatively impacted. So for example, in the speech given by the Saudi Prince Faisal bin Farhan, उन्होंने उसमें they talked about the Houthi rebellion and that it needs to be curbed, and it's allegedly funded by Iran, and how it transports these arms to Yemen. And so of course उसमें आप देखते हैं फिर Yemen किस तरह use होता है, फिर Syria में किस तरह puppet regimes, this and that. So over the years we've seen how these countries in their war has used these two countries as proxies. और अब Syria और Yemen की economy का, लोगों का बुरा हाल है, because it's really just suffering from the war. Of course, not to say कि इसमें West के involvement नहीं है, बहुत ज़्यादा है. Russia, US also were and are great part of this war and the effects that it has today. अगर आप और जगहों पे देखें तो कुछ countries like Iraq, for example, has still not recovered from the invasion of the US in Iraq and its sanctions and इस तरह. So it's a lot of these things जो actually हुई हैं in the recent past or even in earlier past and continues to happen. तो conference में there is agreement on that there is political settlement to war and that these countries hold responsibility. I think one can hope only कि जब इस तरह की conferences होती हैं, so then countries can also look inwards and countries can also look to each other in terms of how they may be aggressing violence, या कि how they may be creating conflict and war in other Muslim countries to further their political agendas, because that is happening, it's true. लेकिन conference के level तक there is agreement on the Yemen crisis, on the Syria crisis, that it is something which needs to be resolved and it is something which is wronging the people of the two countries. Similarly, जिस तरह आप देखते हैं Libya में और इस तरह. तो I think that is, if that answers your question, थोड़ा सा about how these internal conflicts still do remain. Conference doesn't really erase them.
Erase them, yeah. Sure, for sure. And I feel it's also really important to, for the sake of presenting a united front, it's also really important to assess these conflicts first, because what good is Saudi Arab going to do to the Muslim world if they're going to seek US aid to, let's say, harm Iran? And I feel that really then plays a very big political role.
बहुत ज़्यादा जो even बात होती है वो about the Muslim Ummah, for example, yeah, about how one limb suffers and another limb, like references from the Islamic traditions about understanding कि ये Muslim Ummah का और ये OIC का concept कहाँ से आता है is at core contradictory with these internal conflicts.
True.
So that is something जो one can hope कि with condemnation from the OIC General Secretary, with condemnation from the host countries, it also, appears to be that you can hold each other also to similar standards. And I think it does happen to a certain extent with, passing statements or with passing resolutions or monitoring or saying कि ये issue you monitor होगा. And that's, as far as the conference goes.
Absolutely. And I also have another question, और ये थोड़ा आम आदमियों वाला सवाल है, layman question है, मेरा भी है, कि जब हम देखते हैं तमाम मुसलमान ममालिक को जिनकी लेट्स से वॉर टॉर्न कंडीशंस हैं, GDPs बहुत कम हैं एक्सेप्ट फॉर अ फ्यू कंट्रीज़, लेकिन फिर उनकी हमने बात की कि पॉलिटिकल इंटरेस्ट लाए समवेयर एल्स समटाइम्स. तो जब हम देखते हैं इस तरह की एक कॉन्फ्रेंस को काम करते हुए, एसेंशियली आपका कोई भी मेंबर एक पावरफुल पोजीशन में नहीं है. None of the members of the OIC are a member of the G7. I think only 1 or 2 are a member of the G20. UNSC में कोई मेंबर नहीं है. तो हाउ डू यू सी, या फिर आपके ख्याल में कितना इम्पैक्टफुल है द डिसीजंस या द रेजोल्यूशंस दैट आर पास्ड इन OIC? क्या ये एक इको चैम्बर ही है या फिर वाकई जो यहाँ डिस्कशंस हो रही हैं उनका एक ग्लोबल पॉलिटिक्स या ग्लोबल पॉलिसी मेकिंग के ऊपर मेजर इम्पैक्ट हो सकता है? आई जस्ट वांट योर कमेंट ऑन दैट.
That's a very good question, but I think it's a very expert question जो आपको किसी expert से पूछना चाहिए. But I think just as we're speaking as a conversation, I think एक तो जो चीज़ें इसमें बुनियादी तौर पे what you said about how none of these countries are a part of G7 or G20 is an idea जो such blocks are actually trying to erase, which is to say कि आप कह रहे हैं कि हमें necessarily हम एक और ब्लॉक बना रहे हैं या हम एक और यहाँ से पावर बना रहे हैं which is united on its own, like which is partnering आपस में इतना ज़्यादा सच दैट द ब्लॉक बिकम्स इम्पॉर्टेंट इनफ. ऑफ कोर्स एक प्रोसेस है एंड आई अंडरस्टैंड कि अभी लाइक G7 या G20 या P5 कंट्रीज़ फॉर एग्जांपल जिस तरह उनकी वो हैं बिकॉज ऑफ हिस्टोरिकली उनकी किस तरह इकोनॉमीज़ वगैरह रही हैं, दे आर एट अ बेटर प्लेस व्हेन इट कम्स टू taking issue with certain things, yeah, sanctioning, yeah, this and that, and they have more impact, and that's just because of the economy perhaps is a great role in that. और उस sense में फिर हम of course देख रहे हैं कि economy को बेहतर बनाने की understanding है. And I think having said that, of course there are countries in the OIC जिनके which have good economies, which have good relations with the West, जिसमें there is mutual need of each other. तो it's not कि ये कोई isolated group है या इसकी कोई बात की importance नहीं है. Of course there is work that needs to be done, and that is being acknowledged and being worked on. And another thing I think that is being done to kind of make sure कि जो आपकी actions हैं या जो आपकी आवाज़ है वो seriously ली जाए is to kind of include international organizations in this. So such that for example the Under Secretary General of the US was a part of the OIC. Matlab she was here, she met with delegates in the US and the OIC envoy to Afghanistan. She had a meeting with him. She met with human right groups. There was work on gender के front पे, gender development वगैरह पे with international organizations. फिर आप देखते हैं climate change पे या vaccines वगैरह पे बात होती है तो आपकी again non-OIC organizations भी सामने आती हैं. तो the OIC is working I think within itself तो है, और फिर आपको ये acknowledgement है कि there needs to be more work done in terms of strengthening our economies, and then you're also working with other groups to kind of have unanimous decisions, and so the bloc is taken seriously in terms of the work it can do and in terms of the position it holds to shape political landscape. तो I think जिस तरह for example SCO को अगर आप समझें तो it's recently we've seen its power rise a lot. We've seen it become a strong bloc. Russia-Ukraine war में for example we've seen it emerge as this bloc in terms of economy. And now there's also talk about, of course उसमें there's Russia and China, so you do have two big powers. अब इसमें we see China being included in terms of economy के understanding में या generally in terms of supporting the Muslim countries. तो I do believe that we're in the right step in terms of understanding कि किस तरह आपको strong powers को लाना है, किस तरह आपने within yourself you have to find the strength between the Muslim countries, and I do hope that allows the OIC and the Muslim world, which is not just this region but Africa में, East में, to kind of create this consolidated group which actually helps the Muslim community and international peace and harmony at the end of the day. Yeah.
Perfect. We usually end this podcast, and of course you know this much better than I do, that we usually end it by asking about where Pakistan is going to be in 2050, I guess. But on the subject of hope, let's talk about, and I want to know your opinion on it, how hopeful are you about this coalition in the future, and where do you see it going, let's say? I don't want to say to 50 years from now or 2050.
Yeah, I don't think I can answer that also, but I think जो मैं पिछले सवाल में भी बात करी थी about kind of the group coming together as a strong bloc and emerging and understanding each other's needs and working together mutually उस पे, and कुछ चीज़ों पे condemnation statements, this and that. The next, for example, OIC will be hosted by Cameroon, and I think that's a very good sign in terms of giving it to now Africa, and to kind of even this conference में हमने देखा कि Africa से बहुत ज़्यादा representation आई हुई थी जो पहले नहीं आती, and the credit does go to the foreign minister, the foreign office in Pakistan here, to be able to invite them and to put their grievances or their stances or their stakes at the table. तो आप ये देख रहे हैं कि there is greater inclusivity perhaps in the sense of कि each country का role. Speeches में एक और बात I noticed was appreciation of works done by different countries. So for example Saudi Arab को there was appreciation given about the vaccines, about how it helped. China को there is greater talk about कि economically किस तरह आप ये करेंगे. So in terms of just how the coalition is working forward, I think on certain fronts, जिस तरह technology wise, digital space wise, social media के use wise, एक बात हुई कि all these tools need to be used to strengthen the message that we want to give, awareness wise या impact wise. फिर economy के sense में trade ties, infrastructure वगैरह में also there was this understanding in terms of combating terrorism and security. There was an understanding of कि ये conference, ये council किस तरह अपने आप को देखती है to combat all these. So I think if those are the major areas जिसमें आप human development को या इस cooperation के मुख्तलिफ ममालिक की economies को देखें. So that's, a way in which, you can see the cooperation take its stance forward, and I think it's a hopeful one. There is, of course, a lot of work that needs to be done, and we've talked about the areas in which that has to be done earlier in the podcast. So one can hope that, in the future, this kind of continues and takes on a good turn. Yeah.
So on that positive note, I think we should conclude. Thank you so much, Maryam, for being here, for taking us through this journey of the OIC, the 48th OIC conference. I hope to see you soon.
Chalin, thank you for having me. It was very interesting doing this. Let's see what the audience thinks. But yeah.
Yeah, let's see. You can also find us on all the major podcast platforms. That is Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Up until then, I'm going to sign off. Thank you so much. You're probably never going to see me again. But yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. Allah Hafiz.